In 1951, a psychologist named Solomon Asch brought a group of 8 people into a room at Swarthmore College. He showed them a card with a single line on it, then a second card with 3 comparison lines labeled A, B, and C. The task was simple. Which of the 3 lines matched the length of the first one? The answer was obvious. You could see it instantly, but there was a catch. 7 of the 8 people in the room were actors. They had been instructed by Asch to give the same wrong answer, confidently and unanimously. The only real participant was the last person to answer. And here's where it gets disturbing. Across 12 critical trials, participants conformed to the group's clearly incorrect answer roughly 37% of the time. Not on difficult questions, not on ambiguous problems, on answers that were visually obvious. And when you look at the full dataset, around 75% of participants conformed at least once across the entire experiment. In the control condition, where participants answered alone, the error rate was less than 1%. The lines had not changed. The room had not changed. The only thing that changed was the presence of other people saying something wrong with confidence. Asch had not discovered that humans are stupid. He had discovered something far more unsettling, that a significant portion of people will abandon what their own eyes are telling them, simply because the group says otherwise, and that impulse does not stay in the laboratory. It follows you into your career decisions, your relationships, your political opinions, and ultimately, the life you end up building for yourself. This video is about why that happens, how it works inside your brain, and what you can actually do about it. In 1955, psychologists Morton Deutsch and Harold Gerard published a study that split conformity into 2 distinct categories. Understanding this distinction is critical because it explains why conformity is not just one behavior. It is 2 entirely different psychological processes operating simultaneously. The first is normative social influence. This is conformity driven by the desire to be accepted. You change your answer, your opinion, or your behavior not because you actually believe the group is right, but because you do not want to be rejected. You go along to get along. You laugh at jokes you do not find funny. You agree with opinions you privately reject. You pick the career your parents expect. This type of conformity operates on fear, specifically the fear of social exclusion. The second is informational social influence. This is conformity driven by genuine uncertainty. When you are unsure about the correct answer, you look to others for guidance. If everyone around you seems confident, you assume they must know something you do not. You adopt their position not out of fear, but because you genuinely believe they are right. This type of conformity operates on trust. In Asch's experiment, both engines were running at the same time. Some participants later told Asch they knew the group was wrong, but went along with it anyway to avoid standing out. That is normative influence. Others reported that they actually started to doubt their own perception, wondering if maybe they were the ones who were mistaken. That is informational influence. Most people assume they would never fall for either, but the data says otherwise, and the reason is older than civilization itself. Conformity is not a character flaw. It is an evolutionary survival strategy that has been baked into the human brain for hundreds of thousands of years. For early humans, group membership was not a social preference. It was a biological requirement. Our ancestors could not outrun most predators alone. They could not hunt large game alone. They could not defend territory, share the burden of raising children, or survive harsh winters alone. Being part of a group was the single greatest predictor of whether you lived long enough to reproduce. And what got you expelled from the group? Deviating from the group's norms, acting differently, disagreeing too loudly, challenging the shared beliefs or practices of the tribe. In the ancestral environment, social ostracism was functionally equivalent to a death sentence. There were no alternative groups to join, no shelters to fall back on. If the group rejected you, you were alone on an open savanna, and your survival probability collapsed. So the human brain evolved a powerful internal alarm system. When you are about to disagree with the group, when you are about to do something socially risky, your brain generates a wave of anxiety, discomfort, and dread, not because your idea is wrong, but because evolutionary pressures wired you to treat social deviation as a threat to your survival. The feeling of going against the crowd is not just uncomfortable. To your nervous system, it registers as genuinely dangerous. This is why conformity feels effortless, while nonconformity feels exhausting. You are not fighting a social convention. You are fighting a biological imperative that was optimized over tens of thousands of generations. In 2005, neuroscientist Gregory Burns and his team at Emory University conducted one of the most revealing brain imaging studies ever done on conformity. They published their findings in the journal Biological Psychiatry under the title Neurobiological Correlates of Social Conformity and Independence During Mental Rotation. Participants were placed inside an fMRI scanner and asked to perform a mental rotation task, a straightforward perceptual challenge. But they were also shown the answers of a group of peers before giving their own. In many trials, the group's answer was deliberately wrong. Here is what Burns found. When participants conformed to the group's wrong answer, the brain activity did not light up in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with conscious decision-making and social calculation. Instead, it lit up in the occipital parietal network, the brain regions responsible for visual and spatial perception. The implication was staggering. Social pressure was not just making people say the wrong answer, it was literally altering what they perceived. Their brains were not lying on their behalf. Their brains were changing the input, and when participants resisted the group, when they held on to their own correct answer despite everyone else saying otherwise, their amygdala and caudate nucleus activated. These are regions associated with emotional distress, threat detection, and behavioral conflict. In other words, standing alone against a group does not just feel uncomfortable. It triggers the same neural architecture that the brain uses to process fear and danger. This is the biological foundation of the conformity trap. Agreeing with the group is neurologically effortless. Disagreeing with the group is neurologically painful, and your brain is wired to avoid pain. The consequences of nonconformity are not hypothetical. They are measurable, and they are physical. In 2003, psychologists Naomi Eisenberger, Matthew Lieberman, and Kipling Williams designed an experiment using a virtual ball-tossing game called Cyberball. Participants believed they were playing with two other people online. At first, the game was fair. Everyone received the ball equally. Then, without warning, the other two players stopped throwing the ball to the participant. They were excluded from the game entirely. While this was happening, the participants' brains were being scanned. The results showed that social exclusion activated the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, the exact same regions that activate when you experience physical pain. Not similar regions, not adjacent regions, the same ones. Rejection does not just hurt metaphorically. It hurts the way a broken bone hurts. Your brain processes social exclusion through the same neural circuitry it uses for bodily injury. And subsequent research has even shown that over-the-counter painkillers like acetaminophen can partially reduce the emotional distress of social rejection, precisely because the underlying neural mechanism is shared. This is why the conformity trap is so powerful. The cost of disagreeing with the group is not just awkwardness. It is real, neurologically measurable pain. And humans, understandably, are wired to avoid pain. So they conform. They follow. They adopt the opinions, careers, lifestyles, and identities that the people around them have already validated. Not because those choices are right for them, but because the alternative literally hurts. This brings us to the deeper, more personal consequence of conformity. It is not just about wrong answers on line cards or being left out of ball-tossing games. It is about what happens to your identity when the pressure to conform operates across years and decades. In 1966, developmental psychologist James Marcia introduced his identity status theory, which expanded on Erik Erikson's work on psychosocial development. Marcia defined 4 identity statuses based on 2 dimensions: exploration, meaning whether you have actively questioned and investigated your values, beliefs, and goals, and commitment, meaning whether you have made firm decisions about them. The status most relevant to conformity is what Marcia called identity foreclosure. This is the state of high commitment but low exploration. It describes people who have firmly adopted values, careers, and life roles, but who never actually chose them through their own process of questioning and discovery. Instead, they inherited them from parents, from cultural expectations, from peer groups, from whatever environment happened to surround them during their formative years. Identity foreclosure looks confident from the outside. The person appears settled, stable, and sure of themselves. But that confidence has a fragile foundation because it was never tested. It was never compared against alternatives. It was never truly chosen. And when life inevitably delivers a crisis, a job loss, a failed relationship, a midlife reassessment, people in identity foreclosure often discover that the life they built does not actually belong to them. They were living out someone else's script the entire time. This is the conformity trap operating at the highest level, not just going along with the wrong answer in a psychology experiment, but going along with the wrong life. One of the most important findings in conformity research is that it is not uniform across all human societies. In 1996, psychologists Rod Bond and Peter Smith published a landmark meta-analysis examining 133 studies of Ash-type conformity experiments across 17 countries. Their findings revealed a clear pattern. Participants in collectivist cultures, societies that prioritize group harmony, family obligation, and social cohesion, such as Japan, Hong Kong, and Fiji, showed significantly higher rates of conformity than participants in individualist cultures, societies that prioritize personal autonomy and self-expression, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. But here is the critical nuance. Higher conformity in collectivist cultures is not a weakness. It reflects a different social contract. In these cultures, maintaining group harmony is not blind obedience. It is a deeply valued social skill. The group provides robust support systems, shared responsibility, and a collective safety net in return for individual alignment with group norms. The real danger lies in individualist cultures that celebrate nonconformity in theory but punish it in practice. Western societies flood you with messaging about being unique, thinking for yourself, and following your own path. But the social infrastructure, from schools to workplaces to social media, still rewards those who fit in and punishes those who stand out. This creates a particularly insidious form of the conformity trap. You believe you are making independent choices because the culture tells you that you are, but the social pressures shaping those choices are simply less visible. The chains are still there. They are just harder to see. If conformity is hardwired into your neurology, baked into your evolutionary history, and reinforced by every social structure around you, is escape even possible? The answer is yes, but not through sheer willpower. Understanding the mechanism is the first step. The most critical finding in Ash's original research was this. When even a single Confederate broke from the unanimous majority and gave the correct answer, conformity among the real participants dropped dramatically, from about 37% down to approximately 5%. One dissenting voice was enough to shatter the illusion of consensus. This means you do not need to convince everyone. You do not need to be the majority. You just need to not be completely alone. The practical implications are significant. First, actively seek out environments where disagreement is tolerated and even encouraged. The conformity trap is strongest in groups where unanimity is the norm and dissent carries social risk. If you are in a workplace, a friend group, or a family where expressing a different opinion consistently leads to punishment or exclusion, you are inside the trap. Second, build awareness of informational influence. When you find yourself adopting a belief or making a decision, ask yourself whether this conclusion came from your own investigation or from the assumption that the people around you must be right. The more ambiguous or complex the situation, the more vulnerable you are to informational conformity. Recognize that uncertainty is not a reason to default to the crowd. It is a reason to investigate further. Third, understand that the discomfort you feel when disagreeing with a group is not a signal that you are wrong. It is a signal that your amygdala is doing exactly what evolution designed it to do. The anxiety is not evidence. It is alarm wiring left over from an era when social rejection meant physical death. You can feel the fear and still act on your own judgment. And finally, remember the distinction between public compliance and private acceptance. You do not have to fight every battle out loud. But you do have to maintain an internal awareness of when your outward behavior has diverged from your actual beliefs. The moment you stop noticing the gap, identity foreclosure has begun, and the life you are living starts to become someone else's. The conformity trap is not a trap because it makes you agree with the wrong answer. It is a trap because, over time, it makes you forget that you ever had your own answer to begin with.